Hey everyone, this is Matt from howtogardendesign.com. For today's video, I want to take you through step 1 in my 6-step beginner guide on landscape design basics. And what we're going to look in this video is how to set yourself up for garden design success. How do we do that? We make a scaled base plan to work from. This is something that not many people really think about, or not many people do. They just go outside, draw a rough estimate of what their backyard looks like, and start sketching. Scaled base plans are really important because when you get to actually refining your design, you want to make sure you have a scale that you can work off, so you just make things a little bit easier, a little bit cleaner, and ultimately a little bit simpler. So, what do we actually need to set up a scaled base plan? It's easy to use A3 paper. If you don't have A3 paper, you can just use A4 and try and tile it together if needed. I find A3 fits most properties reasonably well. If you have a really large property and you're not going to fit everything on an A3 piece of paper, I'd recommend either doing stages of your design, so do one area on the A3 and then use another A3 for another area. But realistically, you should be able to fit most, I would say, residential properties on an A3 piece of paper. The other thing we want to do later, as I'll show you, is actually scan our paper. So you want to be able to source an A3 scanner if you can. If your work has one, you can try that. Officeworks usually have something. There should be places around, relatives maybe. Someone should be able to help you scan an A3 piece of paper. So if that is a concern, maybe stick with A4 and see if you can scan using that. We also want markers or pens to sketch with and draw solid outlines. The idea with a base plan is that you stick it down to your table, and then we're going to use pieces of trace paper over the top of that, and often multiple layers at once. You need basically whatever you're drawing with, particularly for your base plan, you want to be thick enough and strong enough that you can actually see through multiple layers of trace paper. We also want a scaled ruler, obviously. You want that to be able to set up the base plan itself, and later on when you refine your designs, you want to be able to use a scaled ruler to exactly draw what you need to. Now, I mentioned tracing paper. Trace paper is an option. I prefer non-wax baking paper. Very, very cheap, comes in long rolls, you can find it at most supermarkets. It has to be non-waxed, and generally one side of it is easier to draw on than the other. The other side, when you draw on it, it tends to, the actual pen doesn't stay very well. It's often wet and doesn't, stick to the paper. The other side generally is a little bit easier. You may just have to buy one and try it out and see if it works with the pens that you have. It is a hell of a lot cheaper than trace paper though, so I would recommend it as an option. And you just roll it out, draw what you need to, rip off that particular piece of paper, and you're done. And you can get a hell of a lot more drawings done from it. And I mentioned a scanner, so we actually want to make a few copies of the base plan to work with later on. You'll see in the notes I've got next that a scanner is really useful because if you've got 3 or 4 copies of your base plan, you're not too concerned about the one you're working on. If you need to change something later on, or if you've made a mistake, or maybe you want to add or potentially remove information, you want to have a few versions that you can work with. What else do we need? Property and architectural plans of your site. So this is vital because, as I point out later on, you want to use that as a reference to actually create your own base plan. You want to be using the measurements on that plan, and you want to be able to take those and apply them to the base plan that you're drawing. Tape measure is useful if there are certain measurements that you don't have for your architectural plan, or perhaps you don't have an architectural plan. Maybe you need to turn around and actually go outside and measure different bits and pieces, particularly for things that are on your site but not on your base plan, such as like large trees or maybe sheds that went in after the property was developed. You want to be able to measure where those are in space. Spirit level and a string rope, basically to help you measure gradients. This is a little bit of a weird technique, and frankly I don't blame you if you don't want to try this just yet. I think I found a couple of videos that I might link in the description that should be able to help out with how to actually approach this. But fundamentally, you just want to find, if you're on a sloping site or you have a slight slope, you want to be able to use a spirit level and some string basically to try and measure the gradient of how, shallow or deep the fall is. So when we're drawing your base plan, pretty simple, you tape down your paper onto the table. You then choose your scale. So for me, it will be something like 1 to 100 or 1 to 50, depending on the actual size of the property. Write it down in the lower corner. You can kind of wait for this step, just 1 second. I want you to add a north or south arrow in the lower right corner as well. Now this depends on what hemisphere you're in. If you're in the northern hemisphere, a south arrow is good. We just want to be able to tell which direction the sun is coming from. Then you draw your house outline. This is where the architectural plans come in. So the architectural plans tell you, hopefully, the actual measurements of the walls and the windows and locations and all those bits and pieces. You want to be able to draw those out. Now, I've got a tip that I'll touch on later. You want to draw the measurements. You don't want to just copy over the base plan itself, and there's a reason for that I'll get to. We also, as I mentioned, you want to add window and door positions wherever they fall on the property, and heights of the windows if needed. So behind you, there is a window that sits about 4 feet off the floor. So if I'm looking out of this area and I want to design something, just outside this window, knowing that there's a 4-foot rise before we actually hit the sill of the window is useful, because it means I can actually think about putting something there. If I don't have that information on my base plan, unless I remember when I'm designing, I'm probably going to either not take advantage of that opportunity, or I may accidentally put something in place that may not be necessary or may not be suitable. Super, super important. Add easement or offset information from the site or architectural plans. This is vital. You do not want to create a design that has semi or permanent structures that go over an easement area, only to find out in a couple of years when the service provider, if it's like stormwater or sewerage or whoever it is that has access, legal access to that area, comes through, they need to do maintenance or work or whatever, and they just rip up whatever work you've done. If you've laid decking or patio or whatever it is, they're allowed to come in and rip that area up because you built over an easement or over an offset that you weren't supposed to. Have that information on your base plan. You do not want to fall into that trap. Trust me, it's not good. And anything that you're keeping on site. So if you've got large trees that you're not going to get rid of, if you've got sheds or other buildings or bits and pieces that you're unlikely to move. This is a tricky one. Many people, I think, dream too small when it comes to a backyard. They look at it and go, oh, okay, well, there's all these huge elements I don't want to get rid of. Sometimes it's easier to get rid of, very large trees. Yes, you will pay money to get it done, but it may mean that in the long run, you actually come up with a much better design. So my approach here would be basically to suggest remove everything that you can, even if you look at it right now and say, oh, it's too expensive to get rid of. Even a shed, for example, if a shed's sitting on a concrete base, you go, oh, no, that's going to be too expensive to remove. Maybe not. Maybe if you actually start work on it in a year or two, you'll find that actually maybe we should have moved that shed, because I would have come up with a much better design had that not been there. So remove as much as you can and only keep the really, really major things that, you go, oh, I really don't think I can actually afford to keep that or remove that. Last one is neighbouring items that could impact the site, so trees and buildings in particular. This is one that not many people think about, but it can have a really big impact, particularly when it comes to things like where sun and shade falls, and a few other things that we'll touch on in the next slide as well. Lastly, indicate slopes, high points and low points. So you can do this with little spot levels if you want, like a little cross, or perhaps, as you'll see in a couple of mine, I do like a dotted outline of the area that's approximately a slope. Some people hash them in. Anything that tells you, oh yeah, this is different terrain, basically. And a couple of additional tips that we want to look at as well. When we're actually drawing it, align your house parallel to the edge of the paper. The reason being is that instead of trying to align the property boundary, particularly if your property or your house sits weirdly on your property, instead of aligning the property boundary to the edge, you want to align the side of your house, so the walls, to the edge of the paper, because most people draw from the house outwards. Not necessarily everyone, but for the most part it's easier, particularly when you're trying to do more detailed design work, if you can just draw parallel to the edge of the paper rather than have to rotate every single time. Particularly if you stick your base plan down, trying to draw on an angle is really quite challenging. As I said, the exception might be if your house sits oddly on your site, then maybe you align your property boundary to the edge, but I'll leave that up to you. Maybe you do one where you align it to the side, one where you align the house to the side, the other one where you do the property boundary to the side. Don't align the plans so the north-south arrow is parallel to the edge. I'll show you a couple of examples of what I mean shortly, but you want to rotate the arrow on the page so that it's pointing to where the north is, but not so that north is pointing directly up the page and you rotate everything else to match it. I'll show you what I mean here. So the top one here, you can see basically the north arrow is pointing directly up the page, but we've had to rotate the entire property to accommodate that. That's really difficult to draw with. This is a lot easier, right? Where my north arrow is rotated slightly. I still know the sun goes roughly in this path across the site, so it tells me all I need to know, and it's easy to draw with. So that's the kind of thing that you should aim for. And the last one is for flat areas. You could add a light grid overlay to help with sketching later on. This is, optional. You don't have to do this, But it can be really good if you want to do it in, I don't know, I would do it in meter squares. Depending on where you're from, you could do feet, whatever is easiest for you. However you think, you could do a little overlay, just a very light overlay of, square feet, I guess, across a predominantly flat area. Don't do it on gradients, because 1 foot, it won't map correctly. Basically, when you're sloping down a hill, a foot is actually longer on a plan view than it would be. So just keep that in mind. Only stick to flat areas if you really need to. Let's have a look at some examples. Now, these were pretty much made up by me for a couple of the design things that I'm actually going to show you throughout this series, where we look at different design options through all the different steps. So you'll see these base plans repeated in a few different areas. And as I said, some are good, some aren't so good. This is an example of not so good. So this was one that I made up. You can see out of all the information I told you, we've really only got a north arrow, which is down in this bottom corner here. I've got some windows and door placements and all that kind of thing. We don't really have a lot of other information. We don't have anything that's staying on site, which may be true. We don't have neighbouring information either. So whether that's important or not sure. But really simple base plan. Maybe this is all you need. Again, slightly different design, one that I made up again. Base plan here is a little more detailed, where again we've got our windows, but we've got the whole house. Again, maybe it's not necessary. Maybe you're just doing your backyard. That's okay. Got a north arrow. I've got this little dotted line that shows the eave placement. Now, this actual base plan, and as you'll see, was drawn for a design exploring how to make a garden in a hot climate. So the eaves are actually quite important because they provide shade to the house. So knowing where that line was kind of useful. Again, not a lot of neighbouring information, no scale bar either. So I'm kind of failing in my examples here, but I just wanted to show you a few different options. And this is the third option that we're working with. Now, again, this one's not to scale because I drew it from memory. I wasn't able to actually attend and kind of see what the scale is. This is actually the side of my parents' property. And this is actually a lot better. So we'll start with the parents' property, which is you've got the walls here, we've got windows. And I've also made notes of different utilities that are staying on site for obvious reasons. So here's a heater. I think it's just a heater, not a cooler. A water heater. We've also got an electrical unit here as well. And then I've made notes of what bedrooms are looking at, or what rooms I should say are looking out into this space. And that's kind of useful. I know it intuitively because I've lived there, but it can be helpful for reasons that we'll see in a couple of steps later on in the design process. So we've got bedrooms, there's a rumpus room down the bottom, and an ensuite with an opaque window. Now, the other useful thing that I've done is I've added a little bit of information about a retaining wall that's running along this boundary here, but mostly this is a utility route with, for access, right, to get wheelbarrows through, holding mulch or all sorts of other bits and pieces. So that's the intent of most sides of properties, but it was just something, what can we do to make it a bit more interesting? The other thing I've added here is the neighbouring house, and this is pretty important for a couple of reasons that we'll explore later on, but one of them is oversight, right? And I think I make a note of this later, which is the idea of what can they actually see when they look into this space? So is that something that you want to try and address? And we'll touch on that in later steps as well. But you can also see here I've included some trees, we've got some ferns, there's a timber paling fence that runs in the middle. Other than being not to scale, this is a pretty good plan. It tells you quite a bit of information, and it's information that you can use and adapt to when it comes to designing. So what do we got next? This is my final base plan, I guess. This is one I did for my book, The Garden Design Process, where, again, it's my parents' place. So what we were looking at before was just this little area here. This is the rest of the backyard. Got a 1:100 scale, and you can see I've made notes here. So I've actually set level to be 0 for the top yard. This is predominantly flat. Oh, I should be on this one. Predominantly flat, this area. And then you can see this dotted line here. This basically is a rocky slope that goes down in this direction. So this is about 1.2 to 1.5. Again, I actually drew this while I was in another country, so I'll show you that next. 1.2 meters below this level here, and then we go even further down towards what is actually the back of the yard, around 2.5 meters below this level here. So, and then the house, these doors and windows here are actually 1.2 meters above this level, roughly, and this is about 40 centimeters, or a foot and a half, kind of above that level as well. So that comes in more important later on. But for now, this is just a reasonable base plan. Not perfect, but pretty good. And here I want to show you me actually using a base plan as a setup. So this was me developing this for my book when I was living in Vietnam. And basically just, we've developed the base plan here, we've taped it down onto a table, and I just want to show you the setup and how I was using the base plan to help design. Here you can see I've got my scaled ruler, a couple of plans here on the side that were like little bubble diagrams exploring things. And this is my roll of non-wax baking paper that, again, you just lay out over the top. You can cut or rip off whatever pieces that you're working with later on. Really, really useful. And that's really about it. So this is the first video, as I said, step 1 in my six-step beginner guide on how to make a garden design, really. So join me for step 2, where we will explore something that not many people ever really bother to do. So I'll see you then.